Good morning. I'm Alexis Lasselle Ross, a Senior Associate Non-Resident at the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Today, I'm joined by Ms. Margaret Boatner, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Strategy and Acquisition Reform, and Brigadier General Ed Barker, the Program Executive Officer for Intelligence, Electronic Warfare, and Sensors. So today we're going to be discussing how the Army is modernizing its approach towards Army acquisition of software. But first, let me introduce our panelists. So, Margaret, Ms. Boatner, as the DASA SAR, your primary function is to design new policies and implement reform for Army acquisition. And you've held several positions inside Army acquisition as well as the broader Pentagon. You also have an MBA from Georgetown. So you are no stranger to reform. So in your mind, what makes reform stick? What's the one thing that you can do to actually, get it to work and take hold?
Yeah, and reform is hard when you're talking about a place as big as the Army, for example. And so, I always think that you really need kind of three key ingredients in order to make reform really stick. And the first is that you either change or put in place the right policies and processes to enact the change. The second thing is that you have the right talent and expertise to actually implement and absorb whatever the reform may be that you want to put in place. And then the third really is consistent and continuous support and emphasis from the leadership, from the top down, so that the folks that are executing kind of have that top cover. And those are the three keys to reform success in my mind.
I like it. Love it. It actually makes a lot of sense. And turning to you, General Barker, as the individual who, in this case, as a PEO, is going to be operationalizing reform and executing on a day-to-day basis, you're bringing an important perspective to the conversation. So you enlisted in the Army in 1988, transitioned to the Acquisition Corps in 2000, so you've been at this for a while. Yeah. You're currently a PEO at IEWS, as I said, but you've worked in several other program shops, the Enterprise Information Systems, that PEO Soldier, National Reconnaissance Office. So what have you enjoyed the most being an acquisition officer over the years?
Yeah, I kind of joke and tell people, I can't hold a job when you kind of lay down the things that you just ran down. But the reality is it's just been a bunch of different opportunities, right? And then on each one of those paths that I've gone down, it's interacting with the people and, the problem sets that we run up against. It's just been an absolutely amazing experience. And it provides you really the opportunity to learn. Each time, you get put in one of those different environments, it's a new sometimes it's a new skill set you need, sometimes, and it's always new problems. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's similar problems from the last place, just in a different environment. So, but just the ability to continuously learn and interact with, a great group of professionals within our acquisition corps, it's pretty amazing.
That's great.
Yeah.
So now that the audience has gotten a chance to know you all a little bit, as I do, let's talk software. So, Ms. Boatner, do you want to kick off the discussion? Give us a little bit of opening comments on what the Army's after here.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you to CIS for hosting us here today to talk about the new policy that really is focused on changing the way we do software development and software acquisition within the Army. At its core, really, if I could boil it down to one sentence, what the policy is trying to do is really institutionalize and require that we use modern software development approaches across the whole Army, really very much in line with industry best practices and where industry, frankly, has been for many, many years on software development. And I like to kind of, before we jump into the nitty-gritty of the policy and really some of the more specific changes that we're dictating, I always think it's helpful to kind of set the context for why we wanted to do this right now, why this policy is important right now. And that's really just because of how important software is right now, right? It's no secret. I think it's a very hot topic right now, but software more than ever before is becoming or is already a national security imperative. If you look at the past, software has been an enabler of a lot of our hardware-based capabilities, and now it's really the main driver of those capabilities. So everything from the goggles we put on our soldiers these days, right, to our radars and our missiles, as Ed knows well, all the way to our tanks and our helicopters. And so the ability to rapidly develop and deploy and importantly enhance those software capabilities over time is really going to make a difference on the battlefield. And so that's really what we're trying to get after with this new policy. Those modern and agile and iterative approaches are what's going to enable us to rapidly upgrade all of our capabilities. And so that's why we wanted to do it now.
Yeah. And that it makes a lot of sense. the world's evolving. So tell us, how did we traditionally or historically
Sure.
approach software acquisition in the Army? And then, General Barker, why, operationally, or why from an acquisition execution standpoint was that so problematic? Why does the status quo need to change?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so really the way that we used to develop it historically, using kind of our legacy processes, is really what's known as waterfall development. And really all that means is that we would develop software in a very linear and sequential fashion, which meant that every phase of that process from developing our requirements all the way to deploying the software, had to be completed before the next phase could actually begin. And so it's a very rigid way to develop software, a very time-intensive way to develop software, and it really doesn't give us the flexibility and agility to respond to things like emerging technologies and innovation that we want to capitalize on, changing threats, and frankly, at the end of the day, changing user needs, right? The changing needs of our soldiers. And so it often resulted in, by the time you were done with this process, you had software that was outdated and unresponsive to the Army's needs, which of course puts us at a disadvantage. And Ed, I think, can probably highlight more from an operational perspective what that really means.
I mean, if you think about, either from the 80s, 90s, all the way through the early 2000s, there was this mindset that owning your data, right, and having rights to your data was too expensive. It was just a cultural aspect of things that was, it was in your training. It was kind of what the mindset was. And that led you down the path, from a programmatic standpoint, where a lot of times when you went down that path and you didn't own your data, you didn't own those rights, it led you to sole source environments where you just didn't have a lot of latitude when it came to your ability to support, sustain, and actually be agile enough to pivot to what's next. And then when you compound that with this idea that a lot of efforts in their mind, they had this mindset that you had to have a single tool to accomplish a lot of different things within a functional area. And then you compound that even further with the fact that, from an institution, people just did not want to really change their business process. They felt that software providers should adapt their software to our business processes, okay? And what that led you down the path was, a lot of customization. And when you get in the customization business, it can get very, very expensive to sustain and be agile and do all the things that Margaret wants us to do, and that this policy is allowing us to do. So, so when you think of it in terms of what the Chief of Staff of the Army talks about, the ability to kind of transform in contact and be able to adjust, we didn't have that, right? We did not have that, and so that's why the tools associated with with the policy directive and all the implementation, it's what's really going to set the conditions to allow us to do that.
Perfect. So before we dig into the specifics about what's in the policy, and I do want you to recap that for us. General Barker, you talked about customization, too much customization.
Yeah.
So I have to ask a clarifying question about the intent of the policy. Development versus acquisition of commercially available solutions. So the policy uses the term development quite extensively, so much so and it also defines development as software activity, everything except commercial off-the-shelf software. So because the policy's broad definition of development, it's primarily a policy on software development. I see it. So, I wanted to touch base with you and find out if that's a fair read, because importantly, there's a statutory preference to buy commercial rather than developmental items. And so, I have to ask myself, will a policy on software, which is, where the majority of the activity is development, will that encourage more development instead of procuring what's readily available in the commercial market? What is the Army proposing or promoting with this policy?
Right. So, and I appreciate the question. I've gotten this a lot, and so appreciate the opportunity to clarify. It does apply to both software development and acquisition. Both are in the title of the policy. I wouldn't say that it's seeking to promote one over the other explicitly. As you rightly pointed out, there's already a statutory and regulatory preference that the broader department seek to procure commercial solutions to the maximum extent. That is the department's position. It obviously remains our position, and the policy in a couple of places actually emphasizes that point. But I agree, it reads heavily on the software development side, and I think the reason for that is one of the goals of the policy is to put in guardrails when we are doing software development, where software development is happening in the Army, because it is historically where we've had more of the challenges when you're talking about the software space, right? It's when we are doing true software development. And so there's more emphasis there only because we're attempting to put in these guardrails and fix some of the challenges that we've faced in the past. And I do think there's some elements of the policy that could actually end up promoting the use of more commercial solutions. And one example is changing the way that we're writing requirements. And so, right, we're trying to shift away from these very, very detailed and prescriptive requirements documents to much higher level, concise need statements. And so by making that shift and writing our requirements at a much higher level, I think that it'll open the door to more vendors to propose commercial solutions that meet that higher need, as opposed to, a 600-page requirements document that is so prescriptive that it almost inherently drives you to a custom solution.
That's good. I'm glad you brought up requirements. That's one of the key features of the new initiative. So before we go into individual elements and we start talking about how folks like General Barker are going to be using it in the field, can you orient us to the initiative? What are some of the high-level features?
Yeah, absolutely. So two real key goals of the policy. The first that I hit on is the fact that we're going to institutionalize and require modern software development approaches across the Army. So that's the first piece. The second piece, and really the bulk of what the policy does, is it actually seeks to reform a number of institutional and legacy Army processes that are in place right now so that we can actually do modern software development. And I think an important point is that it's not a technical challenge that we're facing right now. Agile development is not a new concept, right? Industry, I think, coined the term in the 1980s and has been using it ever since. So that's not the challenge. The challenge is really in adjusting our own legacy system to accommodate for modern software development. And so that's really the bulk of the policy, really 5 key kind of process changes. The first we already hit on, which is changing the way we write requirements. So shifting from very, very detailed and prescriptive to much higher level, and bringing in users into that process much more so than we ever have before, exactly to the point that Ed and I made earlier, which is that the solution needs to be able to change over time in line with user needs, and you need user feedback injected to be able to do that. So that's really the first significant change. The second is that we're seeking to use more flexible contracting and acquisition strategies. Right, they're not all created equal. Some of these approaches inherently have more flexibility and allow for our solutions and our requirements to change over time. So when we are talking true software development, we're encouraging the use of the software acquisition pathway, which is a relatively new authority designed for custom software. When we're thinking about contracting, we're thinking about approaches like modular contracting and multiple award contracting. And we also put some guidance in there about the appropriate contract types that you should be using, because some inherently offer you more flexibility than others to refine your requirements and iterate your software solutions over time. Third big change is that there's a number of processes in the in-between that, whether you're developing or just trying to deploy software on the Army network, are very, very time intensive and laborious. And so we're seeking to streamline and modernize those processes, namely trying to reduce duplicative testing requirements by employing what we're calling test data reciprocity, and that does include using vendor test data, and streamlining the cybersecurity processes that we have to go through. And I think the one that most folks are very familiar with and dislike the most is the process to obtain an authority to operate, which means that you have approval really to deploy your software on an Army network. So we're seeking to streamline that. Fourth, new sustainment model. We're shifting our sustainment model. And so under the new policy, our software-intensive systems are no longer going to kind of transition to sustainment once development is complete, which is traditionally what our systems do. Instead, they're going to plan for continuous improvement and development, much like industry does, right? And that shift really just recognizes that, to use a very overused phrase, software is never done, right? So why would you move it into a sustainment phase? They're going to plan for continuous development. And then the last thing that we're focused on is making sure that we have the right talent and expertise, kind of going back to my reform answer at the beginning. We can't do any of these things that we want to do if we don't have the right people in place. And so we're standing up a contracting center of excellence. It's going to streamline and improve contracting for software specifically, and we're also standing up a team of true software development experts at Army headquarters within the CIO's shop, and they're going to serve as almost a smoke jumper team that's available to assist the broader Army with implementing these new approaches. And so those are really the high points of the
There's
big
a lot
muscle
of good
movement.
stuff in there. There's a lot of good stuff. And
Lot to
so
unpack.
there's a lot of
Absolutely.
And technically, she's had that question twice now today.
Lot to say.
So we're going to dig into each one of these. I think that there's some good stuff in there. I think a lot of people are eager to know exactly how this is going to work in practice. So a lot of my questions are going to be, how is it going and what's to come. So General Barker, let's start with you. Let's go to testing. So government testing, traditionally this is a highly rigid process, and it's very regimented, and it sometimes has been contributed, or it's often been blamed for the lag and how long it takes to field things. And so when you're trying to move software much faster now, you really can't afford, you got to start squeezing out things from the timeline and the process. So I think that I applaud you for using industry commercial test standards and also using available test data that's already, if something's already been through a system, why not use it, right?
Absolutely.
So, we don't need to recreate the wheel inside the government. So, General Barker, what should we expect to see in practice? How will this actually look when a program's going through and it comes time for testing? What's going to happen?
Yeah, we're actually already seeing that today in several of our efforts through the testing cycle. But you're right, the traditional path of only being able to use government data, right, has always been a challenge, right? Because vendors have done a lot of that testing, either lab-based or field-based testing, and there's always been a ton of data there that we weren't able to use from a reciprocity standpoint within the government. A lot of that, and then a lot of that also led to the expectation that you would have this fully monolith integrated massive Super Bowl test event, right, at the end of your development, and very costly, very time consuming to try to get there, and also a lot of times very difficult to gain consensus on what success looks like, right? So what we're implementing, and it's really a series of smaller test events, right? And when we see the opportunity now to use vendor data to kind of fill in the gaps, that's what we're going to do. And think of it in terms of a test, fix, test aspect of things, and you kind of iterate. And the thing that I have to be conscious of as a decision maker in those instances is each one of those smaller test events, as you make adjustments, right, as you do the fixes, right, your data from the outcome of those tests, they're going to be slightly different, as you progress. So it's my responsibility to make sure that while we're doing those individual test events, that the aggregate of the data supports a decision that I need to make, or a decision that I need to make to my boss, or recommend to my boss. We're seeing this within the Army test community. We're seeing it within the DoD as well. They're starting to understand the power of this and how it can help. I will tell you that their evolution as well, in parallel to what we're trying to do here, is absolutely key. But we're already seeing indicators of how that is. We're on the right path. And then the other aspect of it is, it's kind of a cultural change, right? And so it takes time. It takes sets and reps to get through that. It takes the right leadership to make sure that we're driving these principles home. And I think we're at a really good spot. We have the right leadership at the right time for all this to kind of converge, and we're seeing the outcome of
so
that.
So the Test and Evaluation Command is on board.
Absolutely.
We could not have a stronger partnership with our test community.
Awesome. So we do have some questions coming in from the live audience, and as a reminder out there, if you are watching, you can submit a question, and the CSIS team will triage those and get those ready for me to ask. So we've got one here from Sidney Friedberg of Breaking Defense, and he wants to know that if, in situations where we're in conflict, how fast can the Army go through DevSEC Ops to reflect battlefield experience? So for example, if the enemy finds a 0 day in IVAS, which is the Integrated Visual Augmentation System, and a fix needs to be made, how fast could that actually be done?
Yeah. Some real world experience going on right now, right? And so part of it depends on where you sit, right? If it's in the defensive cyber or the offensive cyber, domain, you're iterating daily, sometimes within hours, based on the threat and adjusting. So that is and they were kind of the plank holders when it comes to agile for our portfolio, because you've got to be able to iterate. We're seeing instances now where coming out of the European theater where we're having to adjust, in certain portions of the fight. We're on a 2-week cycle where we're updating things and making sure that we're accounting for new and emerging threats. We also have examples within the CENTCOM AOR where some of our programs of records that are operating on an IT box and have had this kind of ability to adjust quickly. Sometimes it's days. I mean, we've even seen 24-hour turnarounds on the ability to adjust to a threat technique, a change in the threats, TTPs. So it depends on where you sit, and depends on what tools you have in place from an agile standpoint. And if you have all that in place, that's what really lends you to be able to have that type of agility. Right?
Absolutely, and the goal of the policy is to really just broaden that scope, so that everybody can move with agility.
Yeah.
Excellent. So another feature that a lot of people are excited about beyond testing is the authority to operate.
Sure.
So authority to operate, which is essentially a credential, allows the software to be utilized in the DoD systems. A lot of companies, especially non-traditional small companies that are coming into bringing their wares, their new items into the DoD ecosystem, they find it a challenge to get an ATO.
Absolutely.
And so everyone is eager to see the continuous ATO, but also the reciprocity. So,
Sure.
That's a big step forward. And because it can be a challenge if you do find yourself fortunate enough after many, many months to get an ATO in one military department, it's hard because the other military departments won't honor that ATO. So Ms. Boatner, since the policy is doing this and since the initiative is to do this, it is encouraging, but how is the Army going to actually achieve this? Where do you stand right now, specifically with the reciprocity with the other military departments? Where do you stand right now in communicating with them and negotiating for them to honor ours and ours to take theirs?
Yeah, absolutely. I swear this piece of the policy is the one that I get the most excited reaction to from our industry partners specifically. A recent GAO study actually said that getting an ATO is the most time-intensive and costly part of the entire deployment process. So I know that it's a real pain point. From a reciprocity standpoint, our CIO, our Chief Information Officer, Leo Garcia, actually already leaned forward and signed a memo. And so ATO reciprocity within the Army now exists. That's something that did not exist before this policy. You actually, depending on the network or the system, had to go through this process multiple times. And so we've already extended that reciprocity across the entirety of the Army, including kind of classified and unclassified networks. So that's a huge win for us and will be relief for folks that have to get that credential, as you say, to operate on the network. The next step is in working with the services and OSD. I think we understand we have systems that operate across all of these networks. Absolutely, our industry partners do. And so the next step is extending that reciprocity. The CIOs are working together closely, of course, with the OSD CIO as well. So that's the phase that we're in now. And it's really just a matter of understanding kind of the risk appetites across the services so that we can come to the same place. But very excited that it already exists within the Army, and we're actively working it with the other services in OSD now.
Yeah, I mean, as an AO, one of the approving officials, right. I'm very excited that we're at this point.
Have you already had some programs that have gotten reciprocity?
We have not. We're on the path to.
And what have you learned from the path? So you're going through the path,
right?
And as you are experiencing it, and you're seeing either stumbling blocks or resistance. Yeah. Are you isolating, where are we finding the impediments, lessons learned for, continuous improvement of how do we actually get through a reciprocal ATO process?
Yeah, I think it starts at the top, right? I mean, with Leo and the things that he's doing and establishing that reciprocity at the service level. It has to start at that level to really get down, from an implementation standpoint. And I understand the challenges associated with it. I mean, I see the the documentation associated with an ATO can be anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 pages, right? I mean, it is not insignificant. So I understand the concern when it comes to another service or another entity, because, as the guy that's doing a lot of both the offensive and defensive cyber, I understand the risks, if you don't get it right, and what can happen to a network and what can happen to our data, and how you can become vulnerable. So there's that part that you got to kind of be able to tackle. You have to make sure that the assurances that you've done the right thing when it comes to the due diligence that you've done when it comes to putting the ATO in place, and you also want those reassurances from your counterpart.
Great. So let's talk about contract type.
Sure.
Yes, this is something that comes up quite a bit, especially industry partners curious about the policy and the initiative as it relates to the contract type. So, as I said before, the policy is, most of the software activity in the policy is described as developmental, and to include commercially derived products. And so the policy, but at the same time, the policy encourages the use of cost reimbursement type of contract and discourages firm fixed price contracts. So for everyone at home who may not be, contracting gurus, the, kind of standard rule of thumb is that typically cost reimbursement contracts are used when it's a developmental program and the government is bearing the risk of sort of working through the unknowns of some sort of new technology or new system. Whereas some would argue that that's not really the case for a commercial product or a software as a service. In that situation, the commercial vendor is assuming the risk for developing something and bringing it to market, or in this case, providing a capability to the government. So why then is the Army pursuing a cost reimbursement for contracting for things that are largely commercially based software solutions? So
I think, again, this is another example of where we're trying to put in the appropriate guardrails where software development is truly happening. Right? So that's just an example. But I will say the policy does not prohibit us from using firm fixed price. It doesn't necessarily encourage only cost plus type contracts, right? It mentions labor hour contracts, incentive type contracts, hybrid contracts. Really just the goal is to get folks to think about what makes sense in their scenario. You can have a breakdown of different, provisions, CLINs, right, to use the technical term.
Reimbursable versus fixed price. Yeah.
Absolutely, you can mix and match. And so that's really, we're trying to get folks to think through where you do truly have kind of custom software development and you don't know the requirement up front. That's the scenario where firm fixed price is likely not the most appropriate contract type. But again, the policy doesn't mandate anything specifically. We're just trying to get people to think about for their specific, whether it be a program of record or another, procurement, what contract type does make sense given the parameters of that specific scenario.
Yeah. It's about having tools, right? Tools in the kit bag and the range of options, right? And that you can leverage, because you have to evaluate each one individually, quite honestly. I know in one of our specific efforts on the AI and on the artificial intelligence and machine learning front, a lot of smaller vendors that don't have those cost accounting systems, that can't go down the cost reimbursable path. It's essentially a barrier to entry.
Absolutely.
So you have to be smart when you implement those types of strategies, making sure you account for the talent and the capabilities that you want to get. But it's not it's not just the contractual aspect of it too, right? I mean, it's really about the overall authorities, I think, that we have between the contractual aspect, the other transaction authorities, the middle tier acquisitions. Those are the things that are really going to deliver the value when you couple them all together. I'll use our Titan as a great example, right? It was a other transaction authority, middle tier acquisition, a mix of cost reimbursable and fixed price. But what was accompanying that was, and it was really back to the kind of the requirements aspect of the thing of the effort, was that we had a lot of different iterations with the vendor, hearing directly from soldiers as we went through the process to not only refine the material solution, but to refine the requirements. I think on Titan we had 16 different touch points with soldiers. It was a total of over 14 months. There was 21 units, 220 soldiers, 1,700 years of military experience, and 1,400 years of intelligence experience. that touched that platform, okay, and informed all that, going throughout the process. So, so the contractual aspect is a tool, and when you put all those together with the different authorities that we have, that's when you're really trying to, you're at a point where you can make a difference.
So you talked there about not only soldier touch points and interacting with the end user, but you also talked about interacting with the vendors and the industry partners that are working on these systems. I think it's critically important. So Mark Meyer from PEO Ground Combat Systems asks a question that I'm glad we're getting to about how do we involve industry along the way. And so he writes, now, since there is a continuous software development effort, what changes are planned for interacting between the government and the contractors?
Yeah, and I can talk to it kind of from the policy perspective, and I'm sure you have real-world examples of where this is happening. But the policy, as part of changing the way we're doing our requirements and involving users, also, developers are part of that. So the policy requires what we're referring to as user-developer teams, where you bring in the developer, in many cases a vendor, to work with the user specifically, but also the program management community, the contracting community. Part of the policy talks about bringing the test folks in even earlier so that you can do continuous testing throughout the whole process. So those teams are really where we want to bring all of these very important stakeholders together. And we have programs that have these touch points on a very recurring basis. We have programs that are already leaning forward and doing this. And so we're seeing success there. And I do think Titan was a good example of one of those. Yeah,
and we dedicate at a minimum a day a month for vendors just to come in and see us. I mean, I will literally, we kind of joke and call it vendor speed dating, where we'll just have 30-minute blocks and they will come in and kind of talk to us. And then we kind of assess where their capabilities could fit within the portfolio. Do we have a lab where they could bring it in and demonstrate? Are there other PMs? Are there other PEOs kind of operating in that space? So we really pride ourselves, and we do a quarterly in-person acquisition lead time, updating folks on every contract, every action, every RFI that we're putting out. It's also updated monthly, so that vendor engagement aspect is something that we take a lot of pride in, and I just see it just continuing to grow as we go down in this space.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about contracting, and one of the elements of the initiative is the Digital Contracting Center of Excellence, which is a really sound strategy when you're limited on resources and technical know-how. Pool the resources, amplify it, and allow it to serve more markets or serve more customers, so to speak. In this case being PM shops or program managers. So it makes a lot of sense. One disadvantage could be, though, the bandwidth of that one center. So, first, is it required that you have to, so say you're a PM and typically you might shop around to which contracting center has the capacity to do your contracting work for you. Are you going to be required to go to the Digital Contracting Center of Excellence at Aberdeen, Proving Ground in Maryland, or not? And then secondly, how does the Army monitor the bandwidth and the workload there so that there isn't a bottleneck that's created?
Sure. Yeah, and I think going back to my point at the beginning, software is in all of our systems, across all of our PEO portfolios, and outside of the acquisition community, folks are awarding software procurements all the time, right? So Aberdeen Proving Ground will never have the resources to support the entire Army, and that's not the intent. I think the way that we're breaking it down is they are staffing up with experts in software procurement best practices so that we can streamline and improve there. We are in the process of identifying select contracts across both the PEOs and outside of the acquisition community that will go to APG to actually be executed by that community. So they will do the execution of some of those contracts that are the most significant, most critical, et cetera. We're in the process of identifying those now. Importantly, what the policy does, though, too, is it makes the senior contracting official at APG, it kind of dubs them the digital senior contracting official, meaning that they now have oversight and authority to issue kind of policy and guidance to all of the other contracting centers such that the best practices that are employed at the Center of Excellence can be adopted by all of those other centers, so that folks, PEOs and others that continue to work with these other contracting organizations will benefit from that same level of expertise. And that's not just true of the Army Contracting Command, but that extends to the contracting organizations that exist in the Corps of Engineers and the National Guard Bureau, for instance. So, from a resourcing perspective, I think we absolutely have structured it intentionally to avoid a bottleneck, because we're not trying, do no harm. Yeah. But sending select contracts there for execution, and then all of the other centers can execute maybe less critical, less significant, less risky contracts operating under the policy and best practices set by that cell of experts, really.
Yeah, and we have a responsibility in this as well at the PEO level, right? I mean, what Danielle Moyer, the lead up there, I'm a T-shirt wearing fan of her. She is pushing the envelope.
Danielle Moyer is the executive director of the Digital Contracting Center of Excellence.
Yes, and she's also the digital senior contracting official, is kind of this new title that has been bestowed upon her, so that she can kind of provide guidance to the entirety of the Army contracting.
Yeah, and we're a lot of her use cases, right? And to get at Margaret's point, you can't create that bottleneck. So we have a responsibility on the PEO side to make sure that that our workforce is upskilled to the point where we can be in that business of executing these types of from a digital excellence aspect, whether it's understanding and getting them trained up in cloud, understanding cloud computing, understanding the business models associated with cloud, understanding the dynamics of an AI and ML environment. I mean, all the different things that we have to do to continue to and it really falls into the talent management aspect of things that you have to really focus on, and it's your last portion of the focus area, and then doing AI and DevSEC Ops and agile approach. I mean, we have to do our portion of that to make sure that when we do get to Danielle's or whichever contracting center goes to execute, we've done our due diligence, we've applied the right rigor when it comes to this, and but I'll tell you, there's a huge leadership aspect of this, right? It's not just, you can't just say you're going to do agile. You can't just say you're going to go to the cloud. The policy provides the framework and the path to get there, but it's literally a cultural change, right? Like I said, you just can't say you're going to do it. You got to really live it, and then your video has to match your audio, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
So we've got another clarifying question.
Sure.
Again, with is it development? Is it not? Okay. So Steve Berlisky of CACI CACI asks, for organizations with big ERP systems, low-code platforms, and other commercially available off-the-shelf products that are quote-unquote configurable and do not require customization or any kind of custom code, can you advise whether those would be considered software development?
So low-code, no-code is actually exempted from the policy, and we do say that up front for all of those kind of exact reasons. So those are not kind of subject to the requirements of this new policy, recognizing that they are truly low-code, no-code platforms and solutions.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. So here's a question for you, General Barker. We are, the Army has recently been pursuing decoupling software from hardware in its systems. And that really allows programs of record to run through different acquisition pathways in a way that's most suitable to them. And it also allows you to contract with sort of the best in breed for, software companies or hardware bending metal companies. And so it's a highly configurable new acquisition model that DoD has. And so I think it's an excellent use of the adaptive acquisition framework. I support it. It's also very creative. But how does it work in practice? So again, say you're a PM and you now have, I guess, two elements to your program, the hardware and the software. They're running on two different pathways. Does this essentially double the amount of program management, milestones, decisions, documentation? And secondly, when you do need to reintegrate the software elements back into the hardware or the platform, when, how, by whom does that actually happen? Is it before testing, after testing? So how does it actually work in practice?
Yeah, I mean, we're actually implementing it right now on, and I hate to go back to Titan, but that's the from what we understand, it may be the first Army program from its instantiation designed to go
Two
a hardware
different
pathway
paths,
and the
yeah.
software acquisition pathway.
Yeah.
We call it.
And I guess we probably should know what Titan is.
Yeah, it's a tactical intelligence targeting access node. It's really the centerpiece for intelligence modernization within the Army. So if you think of it in those terms, right? And we also call it, it's a hardware intensive software program, is really what it boils down to. If you think about the hardware aspect of Titan, there's some exquisite antennas, radars, and things along those lines, but they're all COTS. They're all commercially available. The software is actually the secret sauce. The software and the openness associated with that, the ability to iterate, the ability to adjust is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. So we're living that now, and so what you have essentially for the hardware aspect of things, it would transition into a traditional milestone C, major capability acquisition, and kind of run the traps from a commercial off-the-shelf standpoint, while the software aspect of Titan will go ahead and run through the software acquisition pathway, continuous improvements, continuous developments, and live in that space. And what it does from a PM standpoint, by disaggregating it, your contracts no longer have to be so complex to account for both, and it really provides a lot of latitude. So
it does make a lot of sense. So Sydney Freeberg from Breaking Defense writes in a follow-up question, and it's sort of similar to what we were just talking about of updating the software on a legacy system, right? So how fast can you update software embedded in hardware? And how does that vary between legacy systems and new ones? Can you update over the air, like how Tesla would push an update to all the vehicles, or are you still mailing people CDs?
Yeah, I don't think we're in that business on the new efforts.
Right.
So there may be some legacy residual aspects of those things that are out there, but they're definitely on the path from a divestiture standpoint. And I hate to use it depends, but it does depend on where you sit and what capabilities. I will tell you that on the cyber, defensive cyber and the offensive cyber, hours, rarely days, usually hours. And you just have to be conscious of the development cycles on the other efforts, but it'll no longer be years between software drops, right? So the Army Intelligence Data Platform is something that is a living, breathing, constantly being updated. But there's other parts of that too that are very important, right? I mean, you can say you're going to do these things, but you really have to have the government ownership of the underlying foundation when it comes to data quality, data governance, and the governance that really feeds into that. And so that really dictates what those updates look like, how you're doing it from your program increment planning on what will be updated, how things are prioritized. So you don't always put that on the vendor. And so it really goes back to the holistic approach to tackle the problem.
Excellent. Yeah. So one of the things you guys talked about was that there wouldn't be sustainment of software anymore. And so that's obviously a very big change. And it makes a lot of sense with the way that the software is traditionally developed. It's always continuously upgraded, continuously updated. So my question is, how will this play out in the budget? So if there's no more sustainment, then there'd be less operations and maintenance money, more RDT&E and procurement money.
Yes.
So presumably program offices would start to see an increase in the amount of upfront budget that they're getting.
Absolutely.
And we would be able to see, and outside, we'd be looking at the president's budget requests, the POMs, the FIDIPs, we'd be able to see an uptick in RDT&E and procurement and a decrease in O&M. So has that trend already materialized? If one were to look at the FY25 budget or the POM, could you see it?
For some programs, yes. For some programs that have already leaned forward into the agile space, absolutely. For example, I know IPSE, our integrated personnel and pay system, for example, did that in our planning for much more R&D than they otherwise, would because of that. But it's an important point because, just so everybody's aware, R&D, that's the color of money you need to do the true development work that we're talking about, the continuous development. When you only have operations and maintenance, once you've transitioned to sustainment, fiscal rules dictate that you can only do minor patches and fixes and bugs. It's very specific. And so we're really tying our arms behind our back when we are limiting our systems to only minor patches and fixes and updates. And so that is the goal of that initiative, is to say, hey, you're never transitioning, so that our PMs can do exactly what IPSE has done, and I'm sure a number of other programs, which is that you do that breakdown to figure out how much true development work do I think that I need versus how much O&M will I continue to need for patches and fixes and things like that. And there will still be an O&M, bill associated with these for that type of activity. And that's something that we're communicating to the Hill, and of course will be laid out in all of our budget justification documents.
That was going to be my next question.
Absolutely.
How are you socializing this with the Hill and OSD? That might be an unanticipated or an unwelcome change at the macro level when you see, theoretically, so many systems are software heavy.
Absolutely.
And if you're
Could be a
doing
big
so
increase.
much work and to include separate software, so much attention will be paid in the acquisition of software, it should up the budgets.
Yeah.
So if I'm Congress or if I'm OSD, I'm going to be noticing an increase and wondering what's going on, Army.
Well, an increase in R&D dollars and a decrease in the O&M dollars.
Yeah.
And so, but again, it'll be totally broken down in all of our justification documents. We are having this conversation
Have
with
they been
Congress.
supportive?
Yeah, I think there's a broad recognition that we absolutely have to be able to continuously develop our software solutions, because that's what's going to give us the most effective capabilities to the warfighter, which I think is really everybody's goal here. But I do think additional flexibility in that area will only continue to be more helpful. Just recognizing that the way that we are doing software right now is, these legacy processes are hindering it to an extent.
And we just completed our program briefs with the various staffers, and that was our message: was, hey, we need a little time. This is going to have to normalize. You're going to see some spikes.
Right. When do you think we'll see the spikes? 26, 27?
Probably, 25, 26.
Yeah,
So it happened, some of it, to some degree, it happened this year.
25, right.
But honestly, we were not necessarily prepared to take on the task. So there's still a lot of residual reliance on the Software Engineering Center.
Yes, absolutely.
So little things like, buying licenses and stuff.
Right.
We don't necessarily have a problem with having them execute in the short term until we build up to capacity. And that's been the message is, we have to make sure that we have to build the skill sets within the PM office to continue to go down this path from a continuous improvement, continuous development, and what that means. And so we're defining that, we're planning for it. So as you kind of see those spikes, don't the normal thing is to, if you see a spike, to trim it, right? Yeah. So we're asking for that grace and making sure that hey,
sensible, right?
Yeah, we're
hopefully you
we're
get
planning
that grace.
this. And,
So, Ms. Boatner, you may or may not feel comfortable answering this next question, but if you had the opportunity to get additional relief from Congress or OSD, what would be the kinds of things you would want to be able to take this even further? You've gone a long ways, and congratulations to the Army for pushing the envelope a little bit here. But when it comes to things like funding, I got to imagine there's some ideas you have in mind for perhaps some changes in relief.
And that's exactly where I'd say the relief is most needed, is in the funding. When we talk about all of these other legacy systems, or legacy processes, Congress and OSD have already given us immense flexibility, right? So the software pathway, for example, we can bypass the traditional requirements. We can do the same thing on middle tier. We have all of these new contracting authorities that they've given to us. So we really do have a lot of tools in our toolkit throughout all of these legacy processes. Funding remains the real challenge for those reasons that I talked about. And so some way, and there's a number of different ways to do it. I know the PBBE Commission report offered a number of recommendations. There's also the BA8 pilot, which is a single stream color of money that Congress gave us the authority to execute
right now,
within
So you're
Ed's
using
portfolio.
And it's working, or is it?
We are the only program in the Army right now that's
Absolutely.
doing it, and it's in the defensive cyber operations, and it is absolutely making a difference. Their
Colorless
ability,
money, yeah.
It's a
their
single
ability
stream,
to pivot and address threats and emerging needs for tools, things that would have taken reprogramming actions and possibly months or even years to do, they're doing in weeks and days. So it's pretty impressive, but it goes back to making sure you have the right governance underneath, kind of underpinning that to do that. So, but it's a huge success. it is absolutely a huge success, and we've done a lot of reporting associated with it, and I think we're on very, very solid ground when it comes to executing and meeting the intent. So very happy and proud of that program. So
Excellent. All right, so we have another question written in from the audience. Sean Matthew with the Army DevCom Armament Center asks, what if vendor test data doesn't exist? And how do you align software safety with agile development?
I think if vendor test data doesn't exist, we can do government testing, right? I think that would be the next step that we would do, which is the traditional process. And we didn't really cover it, but there's other elements of the testing process that we are going to streamline. For example, really leaning into automated tools that already exist to help streamline that process. And not requiring testing on every little change to software, but really the significant changes, because again, there's minor patches and fixes all of the time, and then there are more significant changes that require testing. So I think in that instance, we could do government testing and leverage some of these other, streamlining initiatives that are part of the policy as well to get after that piece of it.
As on our side, as we kind of lay in those touch points, we lay in a series of either lab or field-based risk reduction events. Collecting that data, that's what kind of informs that if you have gaps, right?
Absolutely.
And then you take the aggregate of that and make a decision.
Mm-hmm. So we're nearing the end. So let's take one last foray into the next steps and
Sure.
what we'd expect to see in implementation. So I know implementation is always a challenge. You mentioned at the beginning the difficulty of cultural change and making sure everyone in the workforce is aligned and prepared for these kinds of new ways of operating. So what do we expect over the course of the next couple of years? When do you think we would see, like from the outside looking in, a big picture, when do you think we'd be able to notice there's a change that's happened? It's because everything's always a little slow to start, and it takes time to permeate through the enterprise and the new ways of operating to inculcate throughout the whole system. So if we're observers on the outside, when would it be evident to us that change has happened?
So when you look at the policy, there's kind of different implementation dates associated. They range from 3 to 9 months really for us, and it's really many, many organizations across the entire Army that have teamed to put this together very collaboratively. So we have 3 to 9 months to really establish a lot of these things, and that's underway. But what I would say is folks can already see these things.
Absolutely.
If you look, we have programs, including a number that Ed have already talked about, and across our other PEOs that have already leaned forward to implement this. So, we have requirements documents that have been released that are 6, 8, 10 pages, as opposed to the 600-page requirement that a legacy software solution had. We have capability releases, to Ed's point, sometimes daily, depending on the platform, but across some of our even bigger ERP, ACAT 1 level business systems, that used to release every 12 to 24 months, they're down to 6 weeks. They're pushing out new releases. And so I think that depending on the program and the platform or the procurement specifically, you'll already see these changes across the Army.
Yeah, we've been living in this space for a while now. I mean, between, like I said, the offensive cyber, defensive cyber, you're seeing it on some of the intelligence platforms, AIDP, the intelligence data platform. The fact that we're standing up an artificial intelligence, machine learning ecosystem. I mean, all those different things to really capture and get at the very essence of what Margaret's done here. So we're very appreciative of it.
Excellent. Well, I applaud the Army for taking a very big step forward. Obviously, implementation is always a challenge with any kind of big reform effort, so I'm rooting for you. And thanks for coming in today and spending time talking about how the Army is modernizing its acquisition software of acquisition and development.
Yes.
Thank you very much again.
Thanks, Alexis. Thanks for having us.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Alexis, and CSIS really for hosting
we appreciate it.
the opportunity.
Great.
Yep.
So,
Great.
my battle buddy here. So, all good.
Well, thanks for coming in.
Thanks.
Thank you.